do that, there are going to be environmental impacts. I think a lot of those environmental impacts can be mitigated or perhaps even remedied with further investment in science. So as farming increases, as the environmental impacts become more critical, we've got to find solutions. But at the end of the day, one of the reasons for my optimism in New Zealand agriculture is around our ability to present to the ever-increasingly discerning international consumer. And that person recognises New Zealand with that clean, green brand. It recognises New Zealand as having a production system with absolute integrity, particularly around issues of animal welfare, and it recognises New Zealand as producing safe food. That is the brand that above all else, we as New Zealand farmers must continue to maintain.
My concern is about the ownership of the information that's going to be gathered, who's going to own it, who's going to have access to it.
And listen, I'll share those concerns, can't give you the answers, but I'll be very mindful when that study is produced back to us that we need to satisfy those concerns you raise if we're going to be able to proceed without a huge outcry. So it's a problem that will be presented to us. I haven't yet got any thoughts on how the final resolution of those matters should be decided. But I can tell you that we meet with the Federated Farmers Executive on a regular basis, and that is certainly something we're going to have to resolve satisfactorily before we decide whether to proceed.
Without preempting the work of infrastructure group that Terry Hyler's on, would you care to expand on what you think the government's role may become in backwater infrastructure projects?
I think the primary role for government is to make sure the legislation's there that facilitates it to happen. So it's significantly around the Resource Management Act, and as I've given you details of the two-stage process to significantly improve that. The second area that we've identified is seeing whether we as central government can assist the feasibility studies that are occurring on projects that are underway already. The previous government had created a fund called the Community Irrigation Fund. It was available to small projects effectively being progressed by farmers on a relatively localised and individual basis. I moved to change the criteria for that fund shortly after the election. I've widened the criteria so that the larger strategic studies that are underway, particularly in Canterbury, Wairarapa and Hawke's Bay, can utilise that fund, and already they've applied and received money. The further involvement for government, I think, depends on projects that are presented to us on a one-off basis. And at this stage, we've got one before us at the moment that we're giving some thought to. I don't think you can expect central government to go back to the days of the 30s of effectively subsidising schemes. So the difficulty for us is if they are economic, then they should stack up on their own and not require government funding. If they are uneconomic, then I don't think it is appropriate for government to go back and subsidise uneconomic schemes. Having said,
I wondered how we might move to keep control very tightly fixed on biosecurity for the agricultural sector.
It's a good question, John. Can I just start by saying that as I talked through my speech about my optimism in farming, the one thing that would destroy that optimism is if we had a major biosecurity incursion. So of my three portfolio areas, frankly, what is the most important? It's biosecurity, because the future of this economy is totally dependent on it. You've got the Prime Minister working with the Australian Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, and one thing they've identified is whether we can facilitate easier travel between Australia and New Zealand. Effectively make it as close to a domestic experience as possible. That would be beneficial for our tourism industry, there was absolutely no doubt about that. In trying to make it as close as possible to a domestic experience, the thing that becomes the issue is biosecurity. And whilst we have what is renowned as one of the best biosecurity systems in the world, I think things are changing constantly at the border. It's a very dynamic system, and it's incumbent on us to consider whether there's better ways of doing things. The issue really becomes, around the current regime requires every passenger's luggage to be X-rayed. Is that the wisest use of a resource? A recent trial done by MAF, whereby they profiled people as to what sort of biosecurity risks they were, then allowed them to go through a channel without the compulsory 100% X-ray, and then to comply with current law, then did it at a subsequent stage. The people I profiled particularly were somebody like myself who might go from Christchurch to Sydney for a meeting with a briefcase on an early morning flight, stay within downtown Sydney through the day and come back that night. Was I the same biosecurity risk as somebody who had come from Africa to South Korea, spent a few days in Australia and then came across to Christchurch Airport on the same flight? We're treated the same at the moment. In that trial of 15,000 people, 50 people were found to have either fruit or something they shouldn't have had. 30 were picked up, interestingly, by the dogs, and 20 were picked up by the X-ray. The thing that strikes me about those figures is we spent a lot of resource looking at 14,950 people who clearly weren't high profile and high risk. Could that resource have been better spent on the person who travelled Africa, South Korea, etc.? And I think it could have been. So all we're saying at the moment is we need to facilitate better traffic, better facilitation of this Trans-Tasman. Is there a smarter way of doing things? And I'm certainly prepared to look at that.
But particularly, I want to talk to you, ask a question on the Resource Management Act, which has come up here a couple of times this morning. And my key point, sir, is that the National Government's policy appears to be aimed at creating efficiency and resource consent processes, which is, I think, a good thing. But it doesn't address what we see as the key problem, and that is the formulation of plans. And we need statutory compliance and the mechanisms of government controls to come back into place. Because what we're dealing with and wasting our time, sir, is with mountains of paper created from an illegal basis. Now, I say that with a lot of care, sir, because we've experienced it, we've won matters with the councils, we've persuaded them to change when they recognised that they were outside the statute.
I think a lot of your question can be answered by saying that it's been addressed actually in the current legislation before Parliament, the Resource Management Phase 1. I know what you're saying, I can speak from experience. I farm on Bank Peninsula where we had the same issue around the formation of a plan. It took years and years and years. Thank God for Federated Farmers. They worked with rural landowners, did a superb job. It ultimately went to the Environment Court. The issue then was not only the battle we were having with the council, with the Regional Council of Canterbury, but it was the interference from the Department of Conservation as much as anything. And I think the Department of Conservation ought to do its job properly and stay out of its involvement in speaking and trying to influence these plans. If there's a role for central government in that, it should be done by the Ministry for the Environment. DOC ought to look after its own shop and stop looking after everybody else's.
New Zealand's collective debt is in the order of something like $300 billion. Surely that is of much greater concern.
Yeah, the debt figures you talk about are private debt figures. So when you take on private borrowings, you've got to be able to pay the interest and ultimately pay the money back. The focus of mine is around rural New Zealand and particularly the dairy industry, which has borrowed significantly. Some of them at the margins based on the very high output for dairy 12 months ago, so they will be under pressure. So we've got to acknowledge that rural indebtedness will actually increase over the next 12 months because there'll be quite a number of farmers who have a negative position at the end of the next financial year. The private debt out there you talk about is a matter for the individuals that borrow, but when it's collated into a pot around rural debt, like it is at the moment to the extent of $45 billion, it is a concern of mine.